Well, hello everybody and welcome to my show. My name is Jason DaCosta and this is Consistent Preterism. Thank you for joining me today. Today I am actually headed home from my meeting with the pastor, and I was kind of blindsided a little bit when I went in there because I was originally told that it was going to be my mom, my aunt, and maybe my uncle and the pastor and maybe his wife, but when I got there, they were trying to basically set me up to sit down alone with the guy. And look, I don't need a intervention. I don't need counseling is what it would have been, I guess. I wanted to go there so that I could present my case to a group and show them clearly, cleanly, and concisely why the Bible is fulfilled and why it is also Israel only. Well, that did not go very well, let me tell you. It went anything other than that is what it went like. We started out, and by the way, I made them stay because I said, look, I came here to try to speak to you guys. Like, they were going to go for a walk. I'm like, no, you guys are staying. We're doing this. So we stayed, we chatted, and we started in Matthew 24. And, oh, man, let me tell you, I get very, I guess I get very annoyed when I come up against just, I guess the word I'm looking for is dishonesty. And, the guy was nice. He's a nice guy. But the reasoning and the blatant rejecting of what is so very clear was nauseating, folks. Absolutely nauseating. And I have my mom and my aunt to my right, and he's explaining things to them, and everything was just like, well, let me tell you about this and the Greek, and so we really made no progress. I mean, we were there for 5 hours and we made absolutely no progress whatsoever. And it was all because basically he could not admit that Matthew 24 was fulfilled in the generation that Christ said it would be. That was our main hiccup, and we never really got off of it. So we went through Matthew 24, and sorry, I got a bag in my car here, and it's making noise. Let me move it. There we go. That was his main. That was our main point of discussion, and I was showing him how, look, dude, like all these things took place in this last generation, and he kept coming back and saying, well, no, it's the generation that sees all these things. And I said, well, Paul, the Bible actually says that all these things were seen in that last generation. We had famines, we had wars, we had earthquakes, we had rumors of wars, we had false prophets, deceivers, we had great tribulation, persecution, being dragged before councils, the love of many growing cold, lawlessness abounding. Everything that Jesus predicts in that Matthew 24 portion, we have the total and complete fulfillment of in the epistles and accounts that are taken into account in the last days generation. So his thing was that the word generation there is speaking of the generation in the future that sees all these things take place. So it went back and forth for probably 3 hours with me trying to show him that, but Paul, this actually does say that it happened. And his thing was, well, you can't say that Acts chapter 11 and the famines mentioned there are fulfilling the famines that Jesus said would come. And so it was a lot of that kind of thing. I mean, completely ridiculous reasoning. And, look, the Bible gives you the answers, right? You don't have to assume and, guess on things. It's all right there in front of you. So I put it very plainly. I said, what makes more sense? Jesus saying that this very generation that he was speaking to would see all these things take place, or a future generation, thousands of years in the future, would see all these things take place, and all these words meant nothing to the contemporary audience that Jesus spoke to. And, we got the blank stare, like I'm ridiculous for even suggesting that, and it just was really, really tough to deal with. And there were times where I got heated because, it's just ridiculous. It's just absolutely ridiculous how blatantly ignorant people can be and act when you're showing them these things. And then, of course, my mom and aunt, who probably deep down know that I'm right, but just want to, play devil's advocate and just don't want to succumb to the truth. They're listening to him and, shaking their head like, yeah, this is right. And I'm thinking to myself, what planet am I living on where this guy's argument is better than mine, right? It's insanity. And the reason why I'm doing this audio right now is because I'm fresh out of the chat, and I don't want to forget certain things or how it went. So yeah, it was just really, really bad. I'm trying to think of the other things. The Matthew 16, some standing here shall not taste death before I come. According to him, that is the 6 days later, the transfiguration. So Jesus predicted that in 6 days, some people would still be alive, that sort of thing. Let's see. He was using the prophetic you. So the yous that Jesus uses, the word you, it had nothing to do with the contemporary audience. It was a prophetic you. So I asked him, I said, well, in Matthew 16, I said, the ones standing there, I said, are those prophetic people standing there too? Or are they the real people standing there that Jesus promised would see his coming? And, he really had nothing to say there. But overall, I was highly, highly disappointed with the level of ignorance that was demonstrated blatantly, right? This is obviously not a dumb guy. This is a guy who is intelligent and yet could not, for the life of him, see how these things fulfilled, what Jesus predicted. Could not for the life of him. And I kept telling him, but Paul, these are the last days. I showed him a PDF with a bunch of last days time indicators on it. The end of all things is at hand. I asked him, I said, what does that mean? If Peter said the end of all things is at hand, well, what does that mean? What does at hand mean? And his answer was, at hand means that there's nothing in the way of prohibiting it. That's what at hand means. It has nothing to do with it being soon to come to pass. It has nothing to do with it being at hand or near or imminent. It has to do more with there is nothing that will prevent it from happening anymore. That's what at hand means. Let's see, what else? What other asinine comments here? And again, I mean, the guy was nice, but I get a real sour taste in my mouth when I deal with this level of ignorance, this level of blatant ignorance. It's one thing if, you don't really understand things. Like, a lot of things probably went over my mom and aunt's head, my uncle too. Like, they didn't have a clue half of the things we were talking about. But when you're a pastor and you know Greek and you seem to be well studied, to reject what is so very clear. And then he appealed to the fact that thousands of scholars, well-studied and reputable scholars, do not agree with me and all that and all this stuff. But, it was just really exhausting and really annoying. And then his wife kind of got mad when I called him dishonest because he was, I showed him the Genesis 8 passage where, God floods the land and then declares that he would never again curse the ground for man. And so I said to him, I said, Paul, I said, doesn't that mean that the ground curse is over? Right? I mean, how could there still be a curse on the ground today if God promised that he would never again curse the ground after Noah? And, and he came back saying, well, that doesn't take away the fact that the ground curse was still valid from Adam. Excuse me. God is just saying that he would never again curse the ground in that way. There was always a way to kind of wiggle and try to dance around the obvious. But that was when I kind of called him dishonest, and his wife perked up and said, you don't call him dishonest, he's not dishonest. And I basically said, well, yes, he is dishonest. He's not being honest here. I'm telling you that your position makes no sense. I'm telling you that the words of Jesus in Matthew 24 go along with the rest of the words found elsewhere in the New Testament. So this is not just me taking this verse in a vacuum on its own. They literally match everything else we find in the New Testament. And his main argument was that I cannot prove that the words that the New Testament says, about the famines, the earthquakes, the persecutions, I cannot prove that that's what Jesus was referring to in Matthew 24. I cannot refer to it, even though, like Jude says, you were warned long ago about mockers and scoffers coming in the last days. Even though Peter says things about, you were told before by the apostles how, scoffers would come in the last days. Even though they constantly refer back to what they were told by the Lord and by the apostles, according to this guy, none of that is relevant to what Jesus said in Matthew 24. None of it. So, it was completely and totally useless. Eventually, the people got up off the table after maybe 3 hours, and they went in the other room and they ate food, and it was just me and Paul. And he's like, at one point I was just ready to just give up, because I just can't operate in the face of such deliberate dishonesty. But he wanted to know about Israel only, because we hadn't even got to Israel only yet. I was still talking to him about Matthew 24 for 3 hours. We hadn't even got out of it. I wasn't even able to show him the proof that Revelation was written early date. I wasn't able to take him anywhere in the New Testament and show him things. And his argument on the tell us when will these things be and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age. His argument is that is not one period of time being asked about. That is more than one period of time. He would think that is at least 2 periods of time. So then I asked him, I said, what was the destruction of the temple, right? Because he admitted that was part of it. I said, was that the coming or was that the end of the age? And he said that was neither. So I asked him, I said, well, isn't the destruction of the temple, isn't that the end of the age? Doesn't that make sense? And, you get the blank stare, and he always would come back and say, you see, the problem is, and then he goes into a long spiel that's totally unrelated. But overall, it was useless, totally useless. And then we got into Israel only, and I showed him things because he claimed that he really wanted to see it. I took him to, where did I go first? I went to, let's see. Well, I established quickly that, Revelation 14 says no one but the 12 tribes could learn the song. And then he appealed to the first fruits argument. I told him that first fruits does not mean chronology. It means the portion that was given to God. These are the ones who God saved and took at the end. He didn't like that. I showed him how only the Israelites were getting the Holy Spirit in Revelation 7. He said, well, just because it says only Israel got it there does not mean that, other people didn't get it. A lot of that sort of thing. And then I took him, I said, look at 1 Peter 1. I said, it's written to the elect exiles of the dispersion. And his argument was that was written to Christians. Those are the dispersed Christians that Peter is writing to. So then I took him to 1 Corinthians chapter 10, and I showed him that Paul tells them that all of our fathers passed through the Red Sea and were baptized into Moses, and that would be ridiculous to write to a pagan. And he said, oh, well, many scholars think that, let's see, what was his argument on that one? That sort of like Paul is talking about his fathers and not their fathers. Our as in Paul's fathers, the Israelites' fathers, and not the fathers of the Corinthians. I told him how that wouldn't work, because Paul then goes on to say all these things happened to them as examples for us upon whom the end of the world has come. He didn't really have much to say on that. The other one was, let's see, I took him to, where did I take him next? Oh, James 1:1. He didn't like it, but he admitted clearly that this is written to the 12 tribes scattered abroad. I asked him if he was going to try to attempt to say that James only addressed the 12 tribes, yet was writing to the whole church. He said no, he admits that this is only written to the 12 tribes dispersed, and he even said this is the dispersion in James's letter. And I said, so James is writing to the dispersion, the 12 tribes scattered abroad, which you admit, but Peter, in 1 Peter 1, where he says James to the elect exiles of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Asia, Cappadocia, that's not written to the same group that James wrote to? And he said no. I showed him how all of Paul's epistles were also written to the same people Peter did. That really didn't matter, because he was rejecting Peter anyway, saying that was written about Christians, that the dispersion and the diaspora was referring to Christians, which I've never heard in my entire life. In fact, John 7, the Jews knew who the diaspora was. It was the Israelites out among the Greeks. Let's see where else we went. I took him to Romans. I showed him Romans 1 in light of the law only being given to Israel and nations not knowing the law and not knowing the judgments. And I mean, this was pretty bad. I mean, he had a lot of totally ridiculous things to say. I kept pressing him on the fact that how could someone be guilty of transgressing a law that they never had? And he claims that even though the Bible says that I declare my law to Israel, my statutes and judgments to Jacob, I have not done this with any nation, and as for my judgments, those nations have not known them. He claims that even though that's said, it doesn't mean that God didn't give his law to other people. It just means that he didn't declare it to other people. I said, Paul, what's the difference? Doesn't declare mean to simply give or tell? Isn't that what Psalms is saying, that he did not give his law to anyone other than Israel? And he didn't really agree with that. I showed him how only Israel had the law written on the hearts. He took that in, and I don't really remember what he did with it. There really wasn't that good of a comeback. Then I showed him Romans 1, how that's literally all about Israel's history. Although they knew God, they didn't glorify him. Instead, they worshiped four-footed beasts, and that's exactly what Israel did when they turned from God. And although they didn't like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a debased mind to do what ought not be done. And I also showed him the end where it says, these people are without excuse. And then I showed him how Paul says, although these people knew the righteous judgments of God, they still did these things, and not only did them, but approved of those who practiced them. So I showed him clearly how, the Bible says that no nations knew God's judgments other than Israel. And here's Paul in Romans 1 saying, although this group knew the righteous judgments of God, they didn't do them. And they also supported those who practiced these things. So Paul clearly differentiates the people in focus, showing that it's not all mankind. It's a limited context. And he compares them to those people who practice such things, meaning the rest of the pagan world. Israel was supposed to be a light, not a light, but chosen and called out and special, high above all these peoples, and they failed miserably. But they were given the revelation, and they failed on all fronts, and so they were without excuse. So he didn't like that. I showed him Colossians, where they were dead in the trespass of being uncircumcised in the flesh. Didn't really have much to say on that. I showed him, I told him about Ephesians, how Christ abolished the law in his flesh. Didn't really like that. I showed him Galatians, how it's not about just a general law, it's actually about the book of law, which only Israel had, and he kind of danced around that and said, no, all people have the law, and all people are guilty because of it, blah, blah, blah. What else? I showed him, I told him about Revelation, how it makes absolutely no sense for this to go out to pagans living in Asia, when in fact the 70% of the book, well, I said about 350 references. He agreed and said, yes, 70% of the book of Revelation is literally alluding to the Old Testament. So then I asked him, I said, well, how would a pagan understand that, right? Like, how are these pagans who never had the Old Testament, how are they understanding a letter that is so chock full of Old Testament allusions? He really didn't have an answer for that. I showed him Galatians 5, where Paul tells them, do not go back again to the law, to the yoke of bondage, which was the law and circumcision. And I argued that, look, Paul is telling them that they were once under this law of bondage, and Paul is telling them, do not go back to it. And he's saying that, yeah, he's just telling them not to go back to a false gospel. I'm just recapping basically all the little things that I brought up. But basically, in a nutshell, I knew that no matter what I brought up, this guy was... he's been around the game long enough to know how to wiggle around it and say things that would leave people thinking that he has an argument, when in reality, those of us like myself can sniff the bullshit out from a mile away. There was nothing presented from him today that caused me to stop and say, that's a good point. And I knew that coming in. I told him right off the outset, which I don't think people like, but right when we sat down, I said, dude, with all due respect, I said, you're a futurist. I said, so, because he made a comment that, it seems like your YouTube followers want us to engage and they want to see my arguments. And I said, I don't think that's the case. I said, they probably just want to see me dismantle your arguments and see how you react to that. I said, because we've all come out of futurism. I said, everybody that listens to my stuff is most likely not a futurist. I mean, I may have a few on there, but those are really probably the haters. But most of the intelligent people that are listening to my stuff have all come out from futurism based on rigorous study, common sense, logic, and a proper hermeneutic of audience relevance and stuff like that. So I told him, no disrespect. I said, but you're a futurist, man. I said, people are not concerned with what you're going to say. And I said that honestly, I don't have any desire to go back and forth on a blog with you, because I would never go back to futurism. And honestly, debating it is just not even worth my time. And that's exactly what I saw tonight. I mean, it was such a mess. There was no order to it. There was no consistency. I tried to go in there with a plan to like go through certain places and show them how this thing comes together wonderfully. And instead it was kind of like just not, maybe deliberately, maybe not, but sabotaged in a way that really wouldn't allow the discussion to continue beyond Matthew 24. And I tried to just say, you know what, fine, let's move on. But it just never really worked until, 3 hours gone by, and then I have a headache, my mouth is dry, I don't really feel like doing it anymore. And then he's like, but I want to hear about I.O. And I'm like, all right, fine, I'll listen, I'll give you the I.O. basics here, and you can do what you want with them. But I brought him back to Deuteronomy. I asked him, I said, how do you reason that all these messages about the curse and all these warnings about the curse and how they'd be judged and how this law given only to Israel was a curse, how is that not relative to what we see happen in the last days? I said, and he said, well, that all took place in the Babylonian captivity, and that was what was taking place. They were worshiping idols. And I said, well, not really, because they actually set up a community, the Jews did, in Babylon, and they were allowed to worship their God. And that's when they actually had a repentant heart, according to the historical records, and they actually desired to worship their God again. And that's why God ended up bringing them back to their land, and they returned in waves, and he created a new heaven, new earth. And then the other thing was Romans 8, we talked about the creation of the world groaning. His thing, he argued that it was the planet, that the earth was groaning. And I said, well, that means that the earth is going to be changed into the glorious liberty of the children of God, doesn't it? And he kind of like laughed and then looked at the text, and he says, I see what you mean, but he didn't really agree with me on that. So I said, but basically what you're saying is that the earth is going to be transformed into children of God, as in the ground and the dirt and the trees, and that just makes no sense. I tried telling him that the creation is always Israel in this story. There was a point where we came across a passage that said a great famine was going out to all the world. I told him, look, this is limited context. Cosmos here is limited, and this is how they would use it. In that day, they had no concept of China, Asia, India, Australia, all these, regions far, far off. Their world was what they knew. It was the limited local empire. And I said that should give us some insight as to how these apostles and people are using this term when we come to other places, like, for instance, Colossians 1, where it says the gospel has already gone out to every creature under heaven, or Colossians 4, I think it is, where it says he has preached, the gospel has been preached in all the world. Clearly they're not talking about all the world, right? They're talking about a limited geographical location. And his thing was, well, you can't make one instance of all the world equal every time it's being used, which I said, yes, you're absolutely right. I said, but it does give us insight as to the mind of these people when they used phrases like all the world. It wasn't globally as you and I take it today. Let's see, what else? Overall, it was really useless. I could tell that my family was utterly confused. My uncle kept asking, kind of jokingly, he was trying to, I guess, kind of keep the peace, but, he kept saying, well, I'm a saint. I know Jesus saved me. And I'm like, well, he didn't, though. I'm like, he didn't save you. He said he only came for Israel. Just a lot of that kind of thing. And it's just exhausting. It's so refreshing to deal with someone who has, logic. And that's the thing I brought up. I said, so your God couldn't have done this a little better. He couldn't have, instead of giving you clear, things that are relative and modern and, pertinent to your situation today, he decided that giving you ancient letters written to dead people, loaded with Old Testament references that you have no clue about, he decided that was the better route. And add to that, included in those letters, what he did is he mixed in hundreds of time statements showing clearly to anybody with a brain that all these things were about to take place in those last days, and showing clearly that all these things that they were expecting were going to happen before some of them died. And yet, you mean to tell me that God really did that just so that he could, kind of, I guess, deceive people or confuse people or trip people up? And the real meaning is that none of those things meant anything. And it's all just, God's way of saying that, my time is different than yours, that kind of thing. So, again, very elementary arguments by way of futurism and that whole perspective. The one thing that was, I guess, kind of good to hear from him is that he didn't cling to that day is like 1,000 years nonsense that a lot of futurists do. He admitted that he doesn't use that as a defense. He thinks that that's just Peter saying that, God's time is not our time, but he doesn't hold to it, rigorously like some futurists would. And I said, good, because, having that one statement, that one, metaphorical analogy that Peter uses does not trump the hundreds of clear statements that say everything was about to take place elsewhere. So that's pretty much it, folks. I told him he could comment on my videos if he wants, because he is, he's a polite guy, I guess. But the dishonesty and the lack of just intellectual honesty is really what bothers me with these people. It's like, you know what, dude, I understand you don't like the implications, but call it what it is, man. Like the Bible fulfills what Jesus said. It shows that it happened, every single thing. You can check it off the list as you go right through Matthew 24. So sitting there and arguing with me that these things that are contained in the Acts, the book of Acts and all that is not, the one thing he kept saying was, you need to be able to show me that the famine of Acts 11 is fulfilling Jesus in Matthew 24. And I said, Paul, do you expect there to be a little parentheses besides each thing that says, hey guys, by the way, all this is fulfilling what Jesus said? That's not how the Bible works. That's not how the Bible works. All right. It takes a little bit of logic, a little bit of common sense, a little bit of study, but you can see that all the answers are there. And literally everything that Christ said in Matthew 24 was fulfilled in that following generation, because they, not us, were in the last days. And I held to that, and he held to his ridiculous perspective, and that was pretty much where it ended. And I brought up some things to him about Christians today dying and going through crazy stuff for what, like dying of sickness, like Tom Mill's wife, and I said, why is God not concerned about the earthly dwellings and sicknesses of people today when he was in the old covenant? And he really had nothing to say about that, just kind of like God's ways are not our ways, typical Christian lingo. And it's just nauseating, man. It's just really annoying. But yeah, that's pretty much all there is to report. Nobody was persuaded. Nobody was wowed, because I couldn't really even get my arguments off the ground. I wish what would have been probably better would be for me to go there and present everything just me, right? Not having constant interruption where, yeah, but you're assuming that, it would have been better for me to take an hour or two and just go through the whole thing of all my proof. Maybe an hour on the time statements, an hour on Israel only. And then he could have taken notes, either responded right away or another day come back and respond. Excuse me. That would have been the better way to do it. This way was just totally dumb. It was just basically like no chance for me to get anything logical or any kind of cohesive view formulated for anyone to see, because it was just ridiculous, the arguments that were coming my way. But anyways, folks, that's all I got. It was a very interesting night. Just goes to show you that not everybody is out to get truth. Most people are out there to be comfortable in their beliefs. And, and my mom even said at the end, she pulled me aside outside and said, I know what you say makes a lot of sense. She's like, I just can't accept it because it's bad news. And I said, Mom, it isn't bad news. I said, it's actually great news. I said, there's no curse. Nobody's under a curse today. I said, that story is what it is. It's either all Israel and only pertain to them, or it's not true. It's one of the two. And I said, it has nothing to do with you. I said, so your destiny, your future, your inheritance after you die is wide open. It can be anything. It can be amazing. Okay. I didn't say that I can point to a passage, but that's my opinion on it. So it's good news. All right. There is no hell. There is no eternal fire, and we got into that a little bit. I wanted to show him who Satan was in Thessalonians, how it was the Jews, but we didn't really get that far. He does believe in a big boogeyman, Satan, and the hell thing. We didn't really talk about hell very much. I tried to explain to them that the only people that are ever warned of fiery judgment are the Jews. Nobody else is. In fact, you won't find any references to hell besides, I think it's Jude maybe once. Not really sure, but besides that those portions to the Jews in the Gospels, there is no reference anywhere else in any of Paul's epistles about hell. You would think that, they'd be preaching it. Or in Acts, when they're taking the message out, you don't find anything about hell. You don't find anything about hellfire or anything like that. Because, again, the judgment was only upon Israel. It was the final destruction of the city, where it would be engulfed in fire and burned down, and it would be literally turned into a lake of fire. And that was ultimately the fate of the city. So, yeah, folks, totally useless. 5 hours, actually probably 5 hours and 15 minutes of my life wasted. But, yeah, so that's the report. Chime in, let me know what you think. Let me know if you have similar experiences with the futurist crowd. It's been a while since I've actually sat with a futurist. I try not to do it very much. And I figured we'd be able to get on some common ground about, things like the rapture and everything. But we really didn't even get there. It was just such a messy discussion. And I'm really tired. My head is pounding. So anyways, folks, I hope you enjoyed this little rant. If you did, give it a like-a-rooski, and remember to be kind in the comments. Even though I'm very annoyed, and this was very, very painful to be a part of, I think we should still be kind. So that's all, folks. Hope you have a great day. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.